and I'll just hand over to Susan and Simon.
Okay, I hope everybody can hear me all right. Welcome, everybody. I'm very excited about putting this together. Simon and I have had a good time putting this together, and I hope you're going to enjoy it. So I'm going to start off, and let me just say what the day is going to be. This is the agenda. So there are basically 7 different topics we're going to cover, and Simon and I are going to take turns. So I'll do the first one, he'll do the second one, I'll do the third one, etc. And at the end, I hope we'll have a good chunk of time to interact with you and ask about your questions. All right, so getting started, I'm going to say how I got started. IATEFL has had a huge influence on my career. It's opened so many doors for me and allowed me so many opportunities, but I started off very small. I joined one of the special interest groups, one of the SIGs. It was teacher development, and I was just a soldier. I was working on the newsletter, literally cutting and pasting. And then when Adrian Underhill, who's been one of the most important mentors in my life, wanted to hand over, I took over as coordinator. So what happened in terms of my getting to speak at my first plenary was that then TESOL, Venezuela, was having a really important big conference, and they invited the president of TESOL and the president of IATEFL. But the president of IATEFL couldn't make it, and then the vice president couldn't make it, and nobody on the executive committee could make it, and they kept going down, and finally they asked me. And I'd never done this before. I had given workshops, and of course I'd been a teacher for a long time, but the most important thing is that I said yes. I took this opportunity. And I realized that they thought they were going to get somebody really important with a big name, and I wasn't at that time. So I was kind of playing a part. And so I thought, how am I going to do this? So the first thing I did was I started talking to other people. I talked to people who had given plenaries before. Pauline Taylor, in particular, was very helpful to me. She had a workshop for teacher development, and she helped me put together the topics. She shared some of her slides that I could use. And I also put a lot of my heart and who I was in it and what did I want to say to these teachers. So I gave this plenary and was trying to do a good job. And they gave me a standing ovation at the end. And I later found out that the Venezuelans are very generous people, and they tend to do that all the time. But I didn't know that. I was so excited, and as soon as I could, I very calmly ran up to my hotel room and rang my friends in London, where I was living then, and said, they liked me. So the point I'm trying to make here is we all started somewhere. And the first place you start is by saying yes to an opportunity that maybe you think is a bit beyond you. All right, Simon, over to you.
Thank you. First of all, Susan, Mercedes, and Jenny, thank you very much for looking after this. And Tessa, congratulations on setting up the fair list. This is a very flattering and a surprising invitation to attend. But I'm very pleased to share with you my experiences of being a plenary speaker. Without going into too much detail, I began doing plenary talks because I was invited by my publishers and by teaching organizations to come and do something that was loosely related to the work that I was doing, the publications that I was doing. And gradually it evolved into something much more significant. The lessons that I learnt, well, there are lots of lessons I learnt, but there are 3 lessons that I learnt. The first lesson, should the plenary be research-based, classroom-based, or book-based? I think the most important thing to remember is you have to do something that you're happy with. So if your thing is research, then yes, of course you do it on research, although it really does depend on your audience. And if you've got an audience of practicing teachers, then it's very nice if the research can have some practical benefit. Classroom-based talks are always very, very popular and very useful, particularly if they see people who are practitioners. But once again, it depends on the audience. Book-based talks, well, in my experience, the only book-based talks that people can get away with successfully are those by authors who have written a teacher's handbook or something that has got practical ideas, as well as a lot of theory that can actually be used in the classroom. The idea being that the talk will allow them to take the audience to take a few practical ideas away at the end. But doing a talk based on textbooks, which is very often my the reason why I'm invited to do talks, is very difficult. You have to get that balance between the academic and the commercial side, because it is your publishers who are supporting you, and indeed your invitation is through your publishers very often. And this creates what I call the commercial talk, where you don't mention the book at all, but you have to talk about things which are related to it. So the most important thing is remember the audience and feel comfortable about what you're going to say. Yes, fine for academia, but here in the real world we're looking for people with common sense, and of course the everyday practicing teachers really are people with common sense. I'm not saying that in the academic world they're not, but anyway, that's a strong feeling I have. Second lesson was talk about what you know. I gave a series of talks. I was invited to give a series of talks in a closed seminar series in Portugal, and I was invited to do 4 talks, 3 of which were on my specialisms, and the 4th was on grammar. And my very good friend Michael Swan, who wrote Practical English Usage, I asked him, what do you know about grammar? And he's a very modest man and said, well, not much. What do you know about grammar? And I said, well, I've got to do this talk on grammar, and I don't know very much about grammar. And he said, don't worry, I've got this talk that I can give you. And as long as you do it word for word in the way that I would do it, it will get you a standing ovation, and you'll be carried off shoulder high from the conference. And of course, it was a complete and utter disaster. And this is kind of what I felt, because everybody is an expert in grammar, and there's no point in me at the age of 30 or whatever it was trying to pretend to tell other people who are much more experienced than I was anything about grammar. I knew it was going to be a disaster when I saw a CNN camera crew come in at the back to film it. It was discouraging, to say the least. Now, the other thing that I also learned, and I know there's a lot of discussion about how men use humour to control difficult situations, but one of the things that I did learn was to make him laugh. This sounds very flippant and very, very silly, but in the 1980s and 1990s, there was a series of very, very good seminar series run by the British Council in Italy. And I attended the first one and gave an indifferent plenary. The second one, I cracked a joke during my first few lines. And I suddenly realized that what I was getting was the interaction from the plenary audience that I would otherwise get in a workshop. It's a very large conference, and we'll talk a little bit about the size of an audience, but beyond 100 people, it's really difficult to get the kind of interaction that you have experience of in classes and workshops. And I ended up going regularly to that conference and reworked a lot of my material in order just to get the odd laugh now and then. But then, of course, you always bring it back to the serious things. Susan.
Okay, so it's interesting what Tessa's message in the beginning was, that when she put together the FAIR list, she was thinking about the next generation of women, but this is not just for women, who will be going out and giving plenaries. And so this is an angle that I want to look at before you get asked, in the sense of how can you put yourself in a position so that if you do get asked, you're ready to go. But also thinking about organizations, teachers' organizations, conferences. Also, what can you do to promote the next generation? So these are ways that you can start to build your public persona slowly. So getting out there, running workshops. I mean, you're all teachers, and so you have that experience, but getting out to have a larger audience. If you, I mean, I'll say this again, you know, joining a teacher's organization could be a really important part of your career development, whether it's an international organization like IATEFL or TESOL, or a national organization in your country, or a state organization if you're in the United States. You can put yourself forward to say, I volunteer to open the conference, for example, to deal with admin notices from the podium, introduce and thank speakers. Volunteer to be the minder for some of the speakers who come from other places. Maybe instead of being the only speaker speaking to a whole conference, you could ask, could I share it with someone, or could we divide up the conference so that you start with a smaller audience? So, developing public speaking skills. This is something also that you can work on. There's an organization called Toastmasters for people who actually want to develop the different skills, to look at what the skills are, and to practice with a group of people who are also interested in this. And making yourself available. This is something where there does seem to be a gender difference. Men, it seems, will say yes to public speaking, to putting themselves forward more easily in the sense of building a career, and women sometimes think more about their other responsibilities and we are juggling so much already. How can we add something else? It's just stepping up to the plate and saying, this is something that I want to do, it's part of my career, and this is my way forward. Okay, Simon, over to you.
Susan, do you mind if I just go back and add something about social media?
Sure.
Which is to do with preparing before you get asked. I mean, it's very important to, I think these days, to build up your social media presence. And there are a number of celebrated women in ELT who are still starting out but have become extremely effective through their social media profile, through Twitter and through Facebook, and often engaging people to respond to subjects of discussion, to respond to their blogs or their articles and so on. And it really has helped many people build up a profile. The only thing I'd say is that some people, perhaps women more than men, sometimes find Facebook a little bit threatening, and it can make people feel, oh, I wish I was doing what so-and-so is doing, or why haven't I been invited to that conference? So you mustn't let it get out of perspective. You just do what you want to do on Facebook or Twitter. Don't feel that you have to follow everybody else's steps. Choosing a topic, well, your choice or theirs. As I said, really when you're a plenary speaker, usually it's your choice. But somebody, indeed, even somebody yesterday asked me, would you like to do a plenary session on either business English or young learners? Now, both of those areas I've done books on, but I really don't feel that I've got anything new to add to that. As a result, I said, no, I don't want to do it. But it's important to think carefully about how you interpret any subject to suit the request of the conference organizer. Very often there's a conference theme, and one hopes that those themes are as broad as possible. But I think you should be careful about what you agree to do. You do have to be happy, as I've said before. You do have to be happy about what you're talking about. What's the message? This is an interesting one, because sometimes I feel I set out on plenary talks, and I'm not quite sure where I'm taking it. And of course, I've practiced it enough so that there's a few convincing concluding points, but maybe there's something else that you can include to make it more focused. One of the only tricks that I think I can pass on in brief here is that, first of all, it's very difficult to craft a good talk, but it's something that we all have to do, and especially if we're trying to say something new. And when I've done my basic preparation, I've maybe even done the slides, I then write the summary or the article, which most plenary speakers are invited to write and propose after the talk. I write it before I give the talk, and I find very often the focus of writing the talk, the article of the talk before you give the talk is actually very helpful. And of course you can then revise it afterwards if there were aspects in the discussion that came up. But I really recommend writing the article of your talk before you give your talk rather than simply afterwards. Who is the audience? Well, you really do have to find out about this. I mean, many teachers' conferences are obviously for teachers, but there are an awful lot of people who, like in the International ITEFL conference, they're teachers, they're ministry officials, they're examining assessment experts, they're textbook writers, they're publishers, they're all sorts of people, as well as the teachers. And although people who are not teachers are very interested to find out what teachers need to know, it's important to bear in mind that your audience may be really very varied, and sometimes you may need to just think about who's coming, find out a bit more, ask the conference organisers, and just try and bring it all together so that you can fashion your talk so that it's as clear as it possibly can be. Perhaps one important thing is don't be freaked out by people who you know and admire in the audience. Really, there is a point when you just have to ignore them. So if you spot the person whose definitive work you've been reading to prepare for this talk is sitting in row 2 of the audience, there's nothing you can do, and you just have to treat them as just another member of the audience. And I've very often found, in any case, those people are the people who are the very first to come up after you and say, thank you, that was an interesting talk. So don't be freaked out by your heroes, I think is the lesson there. Is interaction a possibility? I mentioned earlier on that over 100 people in the audience, it's really not much difference. Between 10 and 100 is fine, but after 100 it could be 1,000, it could be 2,000. I suppose the largest number I've ever done was 2,000. And no, interaction isn't really like the kind of workshop classroom experience that you may already have had. It gets quite unmanageable, particularly if you're taking questions as you go along, and there's always somebody who will try and hijack the event if you take questions while you're speaking. Too much interaction is risky, and there's usually somebody ready to take over your show, and indeed often ask questions which they know the answer to. They just want to see how well you answer. Yeah. But questions where you encourage people to raise their hand and say yes or no, that's a quite nice thing to do. And laughter, as I mentioned earlier on, go for some laughs if you can. You don't want to be joking all the time, but a few laughs, and have some ad-libs ready if you can. I mean, the classic one is when somebody's mobile phone goes off, and try and think of something to say. If you can ignore it, it's fine, but sometimes you can't ignore it because it's so intrusive. I've often used the line to the person who answers their mobile phone during my plenary, if that's my mother, would you tell her I'm busy? And it usually is light enough to get the whole thing moving on again. Oh, this is you, Susan, I think.
Okay. All right. So I thought instead of this is such a large area, instead of going into it deeply myself, that I'm going to refer you to someone who's done a great deal of work on that. That's Catherine Walter. And you can get at her presentation in 3 different ways. One is a webinar that actually she and I did a couple of years ago. It was IATEFL's very first webinar. The thing is that the first half of the webinar is me talking about preparing people who are first-time attenders at that particular IATEFL conference, so it's not really relevant anymore. So you'd have to go halfway through that webinar to get at Catherine's very interesting talk. And so this is the link for that, or you can just go to IATEFL and look for their slides. And this is what you will find that she's talking about, different areas. So preparing the presentation, so Simon's given you a number of interesting comments about that as well. Before you go, things like planning and organizing yourself. When you arrive, things like checking the program. It actually happened to me once. I was speaking at TESOL, and Cambridge was sending me. I was in London at the time, and at the time I was one of the very few Americans who was teaching for the CELTA, who taught the CELTA. So they wanted an American to speak at TESOL about this British exam. And so, great, you know, they were sponsoring me, and I got there and looked at the program, and I wasn't there. And the thing was that I was one of the very first presenters, so I actually had to get to work and go around, put signs up, and get out the word, and I wouldn't have realized that. So those are things before you go to the conference and when you arrive there. She has ideas about composing yourself before you speak. During has to do with speaking, tricks for speaking, pausing, timing. Things are different kinds of handouts you can use, interesting points about PowerPoint, what size should the font be, for example. Things about your body, dress, Simon's going to get to that, making eye contact, and with other people, dealing with latecomers and questions, which Simon has mentioned. So another way you can get at Catherine's presentation is to go to thefairlist.org, and there are 3 different publications there that you can just download. So this first one is Catherine's. The other 2 are articles that were written for the Teacher Trainer Journal, a checklist for organizing conferences, that's Marjorie Rosenberg, and a checklist for organizing and running a workshop for teachers. And this is by a group of people that were called the January group. But what's particularly interesting about the last is they have a section on the special case of the FIFO trainer, and that means fly in, fly out. I've used JIJO instead, jet in, jet out. And what's this is really important to be thinking about. If you are asked to speak at an international conference and you're just going to be flying in and flying out, you need to put special attention into what really would be useful for this particular group of students, teachers. Not just, what talk do I like to give. So you need to think about what is culturally appropriate for those teachers, what's contextually appropriate for those teachers. And in this article, they also mention things like the fact that you need to keep a hold of your receipts, and maybe you have to write a report afterwards, and perhaps you may even need to negotiate fees and different rates. So that article is definitely worth taking a look at. So we're on to Simon.
Okay. Well, we've divided, as we said in the beginning, we've decided this section divided into tips for all and tips for women. The logistics, the protocols and courtesies before, during and after the conference. I constantly find myself getting this wrong, and I do my best to get it right. I mean, one thing that occurs to me is that do check if you're expected at the opening ceremony of the conference. Not every conference expects you there, and I remember being introduced at the opening ceremony of a Thai T-cell conference and realizing that they were apologizing for my absence, and I was at the back of the hall because I just got up and had my first coffee, and I felt a bit stupid. It's always worth checking if you're expected to be introduced at the opening ceremony of the conference. Something this is a really tricky one. If you are particularly the opening speaker, I think it's really quite important to try to keep to the published schedule, even if it means you have to lose some material. That involves a certain flexibility in your material which you may not have, but really it's a nightmare for the organizer if the conference starts running slow after the opening remarks. And there's always quite a lot of opening comments. Jenny was admirably succinct this afternoon. But, you know, there's usually the conference organizer, there could be somebody from the ministry saying how wonderful teachers are, and then there's a bit of back chat from the teachers saying, oh, well, why don't you pay us more? And then there may be the mayor of the local town who wants to tell you how wonderful this city is that he's mayor of. And then there's the presenter, and then there's the introduction to the presenter. And I remember on one occasion I was left with 35 minutes for a 1 hour perfectly crafted talk. And I had to get back on schedule, and I had to think on my feet. It's very difficult to do, but I do think that it's important for conference organizers to keep to schedule if you possibly can. And find out if you're needed at the end of the talk or later in the conference, and if you're not, let people know how long you're staying at the conference so that you can make yourself available in the bar or in the exhibition area or at the reception. Clothing. Susan, I'm sure you were going to talk more about this, but I didn't know what to say, except that I think it's strongly recommended. I think what I advise about this is find out what the audience are going to wear. And if you want to be sympathetic about, you know, to get them on your side, you say you wear more or less the same kind of clothes. And if you want to be confrontational, you wear the opposite. And it's a sort of standard thing that I've noticed that the most iconoclastic speakers, of which there are fewer these days, but they were the people who certainly many years ago were the people who wanted to shake things up, and they'd always dress in a slightly alarming way. This was taken from a number of documents that on the internet about advice for giving presentations. They always say that what you say is less important than how you look, or indeed how you sound. But there's that final category where nobody really knows what makes a successful talk, and I think it's your creativity and your response which will make it a success or not. Yeah, some of the best plenaries I've ever done have been a success despite any of the, despite what I've been saying or how I look or how I sound. So I have no idea how that works. Your role at the conference, as I say, find out if you're needed. Something that's quite important is to find out about question time. This could be a subject for a plenary on its own, and whether you take questions during a very informal plenary, or whether you say there's time for questions afterwards, or whether indeed there is no time for questions, and it's tricky. But you know, if you're going to do as we hope to finish, you know, in 10 or 15 minutes, there will be time, I hope, for questions. That may not always be possible to negotiate, particularly if the schedule goes out of sync. I always like to say that if somebody asks you, if you say to somebody, yes, that's a very good question, that's a question that you know the answer to. If you say that's a very interesting question, that's a question that you don't know the answer to, but you'll work it out as you go along. And look, a question, perhaps I'll come back to that at the end of the talk, is a question that will never get answered at all. And another thing that I think is worthwhile is just to work out what you want to say. At the end of the plenary, when somebody says they've got their memory stick and they say, you don't mind if I take a copy of the presentation, you put 6 months preparation into and 6 years of experience. An awful lot of people expect all that work to be available, and sometimes it's okay and sometimes it's not okay. It depends on how you feel about your intellectual property. So try and work out what to say when people do that to you, because it's well, it's not just increasingly common, it's just very common all the time. Oh yes, this was a cartoon that I saw about questions there. So, getting ready to speak. There's something that I'm sure other people talk about as well, is getting into the zone, which when you're talking, it's really quite nice to spend maybe an hour, maybe half an hour before the talk, just focusing on what you're going to say. You might even be looking for other emphasis, other focuses in the talk that you want to give. You may be collecting some local information about the circumstances of the conference, which you can use in your presentation itself. So really getting into the zone is this period of focus when you may have to be quiet, you may have to wander around a little bit, you may have to do all sorts of displacement activities. And I think it's very important to think about the first 2 or 3 minutes of your talk, which you'll need to learn, so that you can just do those 2 or 3 minutes, and then just without thinking too hard, and then just see whether you can relax a bit at that point and go on from then on. And those first 2 or 3 minutes are extremely good for the audience if they're well organized, but it's extremely reassuring for yourself to get that completely learnt and understood and ready to deliver. And as I said earlier, try and add some local knowledge to your opening remarks. While you're in the zone, while you're in the focus moment, I think it's important to think about something or someone who is far more important than this presentation or anything in ELT. I mean, you could think it is ELT. It's very important, but it's only ELT. It's not life-threatening or anything like that. Think about your partner or your children or your parents, or or anything. Just to focus on something other than what you're doing. Bear in mind that there's a world beyond the conference hall. And remind yourself that the audience and the organisers are lucky to have you at the conference. I think you need to build up your confidence there. Try and deal with your nerves creatively. You will be nervous. Everybody's nervous. I'm nervous, but it's a question. Your nerves is a way of respecting your audience. I know that you'll feel like that, but just have to try and sort it out as well as you can. Another thing is, well, how will the audience react to me? Everybody fears this is what's going to happen. I remember giving a plenary in Switzerland on one occasion when the eminent elderly organizer of the conference, who'd retired, came in and sat in the front row, and I spoke to the organizer, and she said, "Oh, don't worry about him. He's very, very nice. He's a very sweet man. And if he doesn't like what you're saying, he'll fall asleep." I said, fine. And I hadn't actually got my opening comments, my first 2 or 3 minutes out of the way, when I looked at the elderly eminent representative, and there he was, fast asleep already. So this is a fear that we always have. I wonder whether you say, oh, it's so much easier for men. I mean, we've touched on this a little bit, Susan, and it's interesting. I don't know if it's easier for men, but probably the reason I don't know is that I've never been a woman, so I can't say. Once again, to stress, I think your nerves are respect for your audience, and I think it's a good thing to be nervous and show that you're interested in what the audience are going to make of what you've got to say. And then finally, last comments, well, stay very focused during the opening ceremony. That can be something that goes on for a very, very long time. Go very, very focused through everyone else's introduction. This is a very nerve-wracking business, and stay focused during your own introduction. There was another plenary once that I gave in Turkey where I had to sit through a piano recital, and then one in Russia where I had to sit through some opera singing before I could give my plenary talk, and it was tough. It was tough. And finally, when you're ready to go, stand up, take a big breath, and smile. And I'm told by when I was having some medical tests done, I was rather nervous that the nurse very kindly just said to me, "Take a breath and smile," because it releases all sorts of endorphins, and it really does make you calm down. And I do believe that's the best way to get control of yourself. Okay, Susan, that's me.
Right, Simon. Okay, so Simon was giving some tips for everyone, and these are some tips that are particularly for women, especially women who are starting out giving these talks. So I want to make sure that you know what the FAIR List is. This talk is being sponsored by the FAIR List, by the Leadership and Management SIG, and by NILE. The FAIR List was set up to encourage gender balance at UK ELT events. It's not a deficit award. It's not trying to point the finger at organizations that do not get a balance right between men and women. It's trying to celebrate those who do get it right, and in fact it is an award. This is the certificate that has been given out, I think, to 2 different IATEFL conferences. Now it's been awarded. We award excellence in innovation and publications, and this is in gender balance. So I'd like to talk a bit about women on the stage, and this has been a thread going through this talk, and I'm just going to focus it here. So as I've said a number of times, we need to say yes more often. And in terms of training in public speaking and leadership, and I want to put that together with the saying yes more often, leadership is, we have something that we want to share with the world, and we want to step up to the plate, step up onto the world stage and share this, and that means getting ourselves out there. Something that we can start to do is to make a real point of including women more in our references and the names that we drop when we're speaking. And these different points are on the FAIR List. If you go to the FAIR List website, it is a real resource with lots of ideas for anybody, and particularly women who want tips about getting on stage more often. We need to put more effort into identifying women. There is a bit of a cult of the personality in ELT and at conferences. You will often go to conferences and see some of the same names. We know who the celebrities are. It's harder work to find those women, but it's worth it. Doing the effort. So there are some ideas on the FAIR List website about how to do this. It's things like talking to people who've been to other conferences, looking at the list of plenary names of other conferences on the websites, talking to people who know others, also saying, do you know anybody who you think is ready for this? You know, that maybe they could, with some mentoring, they would be ready to take this step forward. Cultivating a public persona. that is as you do in any kind of profession. If you decide how you want to advance, where you want to go next, setting yourself up some goals about what the direction is forward. And that can be one, to say, I want to cultivate this, I want to go in this direction. Yeah, sorry, I'm having some trouble with my mouse here. There we go. So what I'd like to share now are the pictures of some women who are on the Fairlist website who have sent their pictures in, and I would like to encourage you also, if you have been giving a public talk, send your photograph in. Let's get a really good, it's called the gallery. So this is Ann Burns. This is Jenny Pugsley. This is Diana Markovic Hajdar-Hodzic, former student of mine. Nikki Hockley. Kathleen Graves. Sue Leather. Jenny Johnson, who's the moderator of this talk. And this is one of the favorite ones of me. So I'm going to close here by showing a picture of our Tessa Woodward. And this is with Gisela Bors also, who is the designer of the Fairlist website. And they are all dressed up because they are on their way to the Elton ceremony. The Fairlist was shortlisted for the Innovation in Local Design. So we're very proud of them. And that's it. And now if you have questions, we'd be very, very happy to deal with them. Jenny, are you coming in to work on this, or I don't see any questions. Let's see. Simon, do you see any questions?
Well, I think, I'm not sure if Maha Hassan is asking, okay, who should we send the photos to? Maha Hassan has said, how should we introduce ourselves to you? I don't know whether that's a question to us. Who should we say? Susan, can you answer the question, who should we send the photos to?
I'm not exactly sure how that would work. If you go to the Fairlist and click onto the gallery, there probably are instructions about how to do that.
Yeah, we're not, I'm looking at the chat line, and there are getting plenty of people saying excellent tips, but we want some tricky questions.
So that we can say, oh, that's a good, excellent question.
Perhaps I can come back to that at the end of the book. Tessa, do you want to take Tessa's question, Susan?
Do you think that being nervous is actually being too self-absorbed? That if you think about participants, right? Yes, I think that's a great piece of advice that Adrian Underhill gave me a long time ago, where he gives to other people. When you go to conferences, instead of thinking about, oh, I'm nervous, how I'm feeling, but to actually reach out to others and to see what others have to say, what they're interested in.
Yes. Can I just come back on that?
Yeah.
Nobody is a greater fan of Adrian than I am. He's an extraordinary man. I think that's a very good thing for Adrian to say. I think there are people who are different to Adrian. And I think nerves, as I've always said, are a natural way of showing your respect for the audience. So, yeah, self-absorbed, yes, self-indulgent, but there's not much you can do about it. But it does make you, I think, do an honest, a better talk. I'm very, very I'm totally convinced that if you're honest and show integrity when you give your talk, even if you reveal on occasions your nerves, then your audience will be supportive and kind. I'm convinced that is the case.
I guess I also think that the audience is made up of fellow teachers.
Yes.
And if I have something to say that might be of inspiration, you know, it's a gift that I hope will be of help. I'm trying to be helpful. That's my attitude.
Okay.
Simon, do you want to pick up on the social media one?
Except Facebook, yeah. I mean, Twitter is. I suppose Twitter and Facebook are the two which I use more often. Twitter has been less popular in ELT for about 18 months. I'm not quite sure why. I think that the various Facebook groups are slightly more focused. The ITEFL Facebook group is a very good one. I don't know whether the Fairlist has its own Facebook group, but if they don't, then maybe something we should consider, because there's enormous buddy support going on there, and you do have to be careful about the hype of other presenters, the other people who are, you know, traveling everywhere, and you're wondering why you're not being invited and doing all these kind of things. Facebook, I think, is very, very important. Twitter is a little bit diffuse, although once again, a Twitter Fairlist thread would be very successful, I'm sure. There's an excellent example of ELT-focused Twitter thread on ELT Chat, which is every Wednesday at midday UTC +1. That's UK time, and there's a lot you can do with Twitter and discussion groups like that. But I don't know of other social media which would be more relevant than Twitter and Facebook.
Okay.
Susan, do you want to do something about the group dynamic?
Do you think a group dynamic could be a good strategy in a presentation? I always try to get some kind of group work going in my plenaries, regardless of how many people there are. If for no other reason than people can get tired of speaking to me, or maybe I need to pause. But more importantly, listening to somebody speak for an hour is a long time. It's a long time to process things. So I try to give opportunities for people to stop and reflect. And it can be as simple as talk to the person next to you. What are you thinking so far? What's resonating with you? Or I can actually give them a task to do. I try to state this at the beginning of my talk, that there will be some group work that you're going to do, and maybe I will say, please introduce yourself to the person next to you. You're going to be talking to that person. I always try to do this.
Can I just pick up on that? I mean, yeah. I think it's a personal choice. I tend not to do it, and I quite understand that you do it. I think it's a great idea because it allows you time to calm down and think if you're nervous when you start, and that's great. I just noticed a comment by Lilette from Mexico. I've attended some conferences and noticed lecturers start with a short story, and I think it's very useful and catchy for the audience. Well, that's a great idea for me as well, because it's kind of, obviously it's related to the subject, but it's lightening the mood before you have to go into the serious stuff. And it's not only good for the audience, but it's good for you to have time to relax and get into the thing. It goes back to what I was saying. Prepare your first 2 or 3 minutes, maybe your first 5 minutes, very, very carefully, and then you can get on to the important stuff.
Yeah, I think Catherine gives the advice of doing that last, actually. After you've got the whole thing together, then go back and then plan the beginning. So Carol Reed is saying, what advice would you give to new plenary speakers about how to go about structuring their talk? And I think the very basic thing is, and this is cultural, is tell them what you're going to tell them, and then tell them, and then tell them what you told them. This certainly works in the United States, and we expect that a lot of things will have that structure, and so it's a familiar structure. So I think that's the way I usually work with planning. How about you, Simon? Do you have a particular structure when you're putting something together?
No, I mean, in some ways it's very much more organic, but I have noted down something that for slightly less structured talks, when you've got a collection of ideas, the device which is 10 new thoughts about teaching vocabulary, or 8 points about, or 8 lessons I've learned about textbook writing, or something like that. That kind of listing can be quite using that as a conference title, as a plenary title, that gives sets up a certain number of expectations, and it means that some disparate ideas that you may have, which may be worth discussing and presenting to people, can be incorporated and turned into a very good plenary. So that, you know, the 10 ideas or the 8 ideas thing, I think, is a very good way of organising talks. It's one of many, I'm sure.
Yeah, it's also valid, not in all situations, but in many situations, to develop a work in progress. I know over the years that I was working on my PhD, I spoke about where I was every possible chance I had, because I wanted to have some interaction with the audience. So I could say, this is where I am right now, this is what I've discovered. What do you think about this? And then I would get ideas to go back. So it can also be a time of exchange. It just doesn't have to be, you know, the sage on the stage coming and I'm presenting, I'm the expert, I know everything about something. But to open it up and to say, this is a question I have, this is a puzzle that I have, and I'm interested in where you are with that as well.
That looks like all the questions. What's
Yeah.
the proposal for the CET webinar? I don't know.
Yes, I wonder if, I know very vaguely about this. I wonder if either Jenny could come in to talk about this, or if Tessa could write in to say on the chat right now about the proposal for the CET webinar, which is a great idea.
Or is it going to be one of those questions that you ask that you'll never get answers?
Okay, let me just read off what it says. So all those attending the webinar will have the opportunity to put in a proposal for a webinar of their own to Cambridge English Teacher. That's what CET is. If their proposal is selected, they will have the chance to do their first plenary via audio-only webinar with help from a supportive CET moderator. That's a great place to start. So...
And Tessa has suggested contact her through the fairlist.org
Okay.
website. So, and Jen is checking CET webinar proposals. So, Maria, I think that's the best place to follow that up.
Okay.
Okay. Any more questions?
All right. Well, thank you, everybody. We've enjoyed putting this together. I'm good. Simon, we have to have a new project to work on now. I've learned some new vocabulary working with you. Vice versa.
It's been great fun doing it, Susan. I want to thank you very much, and great collaboration. It's been very, very enjoyable. Thank you once again to Mercedes and Jenny, and above all to Tessa for setting up the fair list. I think it's an amazing achievement, and terribly flattered to be involved. Thank you very much.
All right. Bye, everybody.
Bye.